to get over is this is not going to be a manifesto which puts some big spending commitment on the front page. They want the focus to be on fiscal responsibility, on paying off the deficit, but still some important questions to answer. And the Shadow Chancellor Ed Balls joins me now, and maybe you can answer some of them. Number one is, how big a deficit would you be prepared to run by the end of the next Parliament? Because you're only going to balance the current account, not capital account.
Well, we're going to actually go further than that. We're aiming to have on the current budget, excluding investment, not just balance, but a surplus, and to get the national debt falling. And how fast we can get the national debt falling, how big a surplus, depends, of course, what happens to the economy, where the tax revenues come in. I set an objective of £7.5 billion a year from tackling tax avoidance by the middle of the Parliament, not just the abolition of non-domicile, but going further than that. But the pace at which we get the deficit down depends upon those revenues coming in. Okay. But what we are saying today, Norman, is nothing in our manifesto today will involve any additional borrowing for current spending or for capital spending. The reason why we're outside the Rovers Return is because people in the Rovers Return and across the country need to know the sums add up and everything's paid for.
OK, we'll come to the Rovers Return in a minute. But just to be clear, the IFS said you could run a deficit of 30 billion by 2020. Is that right?
But the IFS are making some assumptions there about only balancing the current budget by 2020. I said we want a surplus, not just balance, and I would like to do it earlier than 2020.
Just to be clear, you want a surplus on the overall deficit by 2020, including capital spending?
No, on the overall current budget,
well, what I want to know is,
excluding investment.
In terms of the deficit, how big a deficit would you think is acceptable?
Well, the commitment we're making today is the overall deficit will fall every year. That will be the first line of our budget. It's on the first page of our manifesto. No additional borrowing in our manifesto for any of our promises.
Have a deficit by 2020.
Well, it depends upon the scale of the surplus on the current budget we can achieve. But it is right. My objective is different from George Osborne's. He's aiming for an overall budget surplus, and he wants to do that by 2018. And he says he can do that by having deeper spending cuts in the next 3 years than in the last 5. And he's also got all these massive unfunded commitments where he's not saying where the money will come from. Mine is a more balanced objective, and we're going to do it in a different way, not only based upon deep spending cuts, but the scale of the surplus will depend upon the economy and the revenues coming in.
But let me put it to you, you haven't actually given us a firm commitment on getting rid of the deficit. You've simply said you're going to get rid of the current deficit. Yeah, but there's a huge, great hole. What is the capital deficit going to be?
But because the point is, if you can get the current budget into surplus, then the national debt starts to fall. And the scale of that overall surplus, now we've always said there's a difference between current spending, which has always got to be covered by tax revenues, and capital spending, but the deficit...
That allows you to spend like billion on housing, on infrastructure. You can just run up any size of deficit if you exclude capital spending.
But well, first of all, the commitment is the current budget surplus and the national debt falling, and we will have a falling national debt, and that therefore means absolutely a constraint. But secondly, Norman, we're doing a manifesto today which has no additional spending paid for by borrowing, current or capital. That is our budget responsibility log, audited by the Office of Budget Responsibility, the deficit falling every year, an unequivocal commitment from us. The choice in the election is this: nothing from Labour is not paid for. We show where the money will come from. All the manifesto promises...
Just let me hold it. You haven't actually. Where are you going to get all these savings you've identified in unprotected government departments?
Sure. Well, in the police budget, from savings by procuring across forces and abolishing the police and crime commissioner elections, we can make £800 million of savings. In local government, through local authorities working together, we've identified £500 million. £200 million in the housing benefit budget, savings from not going ahead with new free schools of £230 million in education. That's alongside...
That's around £2 billion.
Well, look, billions of pounds.
We've got a deficit of about 70 billion.
Yeah, and therefore our approach is about sensible spending cuts, everything being costed and paid for, and increasing the top rate of income tax for people earning over £150,000, and the winter fuel allowance from the richest pensioners being taken away, and £7.5 billion from tax avoidance, and action on jobs and growth. Everything which we're going to do, free childcare, more nurses and doctors, what we're saying to help small businesses, it's all paid for. What you're not going to get from Labour is promises. George Osborne yesterday, 18 times, Andrew Marr said, where's the £8 billion from the NHS coming from? He couldn't answer. He couldn't answer on rail fares. The Tories are taking people for fools. Everybody knows if the Tories get in, they'll raise VAT and cut the NHS. From Labour today, everything costed and paid for. Our sums added up and we'll cut the deficit too.
Ed Balls, thanks very much. I was going to ask you a few googlies on Corrie, but
Shall we pop in for half a mile?
Thanks very much. OK, so Labour's election launch, we're expecting that around about 11 o'clock this morning.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Noel. The family of a 7-year-old boy who died